The following podcast is a deep, shallow dive production.
And you're gonna love it.
Okay, let's go.
All right, so I think my friend Brandon and my brother are going to be incredibly excited for this interview. And I told you this before we got online, but I'm going to say it again. James Corbett and Whitney Webb are the two names that I wish more people in this world subscribed to and knew and took in your content on a daily basis, because I'll be honest, man, I love your takes and I really appreciate you taking the time to come on the Deep Shallow Dive. And listen, everybody, we've got James Corbett from the Corbett Report, who has my favorite 5-minute clip that breaks down 9/11. And I'm going to play that for you guys at another time. But hey, welcome, buddy. I really am excited for this.
No problem. Thanks for taking the time to talk to me.
No problem. All right, listen, I had sent you 4 topics that I wanted to cover: Iran versus Israel and Trump, Trump's Iran policy, bombs, sanctions, diplomacy. Number 3 was Henry Kissinger and Cambodia, war crimes, secrecy, and propaganda. And number 4 was the media matrix and geopolitics. And as soon as I hit send, I realized that's probably a 4-hour podcast. Yeah. So let's focus on what's going on. Iran, Israel, Trump. You put something out the other day. Why don't you give us your take, man?
All right. Yeah. Well, we're talking obviously in the midst of moving events. So whatever we talk about is probably going to be dated by the time people hear it. But given what the situation that appears to be holding at the moment, where there's this tenuous ceasefire that was almost broken, but maybe not, who knows exactly how this is going to play out. But all I know is that this is not surprising that it has landed here at the cusp of a potential World War III type scenario. And I'm not saying World War III is breaking out, but this is the type of events that are leading us along that path. And I've been saying that since 2007. I started the Corbett Report in June of 2007, and my second ever podcast episode was called World War III Starts in Iran. Because, of course, people will remember at that time, it was in the depths of the George W. Bush second term, where actual President Cheney was maneuvering behind the scenes to try to gin up a war with Iran as one of the next targets on the 7 countries in 5 years list that General Wesley Clark had blown the whistle about back in the early 2000s, where he said, I was shown the list. 7 countries in 5 years that were on this hit list in the wake of 9/11 at the Pentagon. They were talking about this.
Yeah, I've played that clip. I've played that clip a lot. Like, that clip is so important. And just out of curiosity, whatever happened to General Wesley Clark? Like, I almost feel like he kind of got silenced after that clip, because that clip, I mean, it hit hard then, but it is hitting hard now, because people are going back and being like, holy mackerel, this guy told this to us in 2007.
Right. And of course, who was on that list? Iraq, Libya, Syria, Iran, a lot of the countries that have been going down like dominoes, one after another. And so it's in that context that the fact that Israel strikes and they get the U.S. to back them up on it should not be particularly surprising. I mean, I guess the question is, why now? Why specifically this moment? And one of the intriguing answers to that actually comes from the fact that the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, which is the UN's nuclear watchdog, which for years and years, for decades now, has been assuring the world that the Iranians, yes, the Iranians are enriching uranium, but they do not have a nuclear weapons program. There is no sign of a nuclear weapons program. They are not working on nuclear weapons. And this is not an imminent threat. They've been saying this for year after year after year after year, until just a few weeks ago, when they voted to censure Iran for their recent enrichment activities and saying, oh, they're starting to enrich to, dangerous levels now. And apparently, I haven't dug into this in great detail yet, but apparently reports are indicating that what actually caused that trigger that caused the IAEA to censure Iran was a Palantir-run program called Mosaic that snarfs up all of this data and spits out an assessment saying, hey, the Iranians are getting dangerously close to a nuclear weapon. So as it turns out, Palantir, which is a company that most people had never heard of until a few months ago, but now everyone has heard of. Well, I'm glad they've heard of it now. But this Palantir company is apparently part of the calculus that triggered these recent events, which I find fascinating and horrifying in equal degree.
That's incredible. So is this saying that Palantir kind of tricked this organization, the IEA or whatever? But yeah, that's pretty wild.
That is apparently because Iran is now saying that when the dust settles on this, we are going to hold the IAEA chief responsible for these events, because it was that vote to censure that was essentially the excuse that Israel needed in order to say something had changed enough for them to justify these strikes.
You know, I think we have moved from physical false flags to digital false flags. I mean, that really is a artificially intelligent digital false flag. And wow, that's wild. I did not know that. But you know, that makes complete sense, because Palantir has been at the center of so many things, and all of a sudden that company is completely on the map and on people's mind and on social media. Okay, that is pretty wild. All right, so that makes a lot more sense as to why now. You know, this 7-country in 5 years thing, I mean, man, this really goes back to obviously George W. Bush and the neoconservatives and the whole Project for a New America Century. You know, do you feel like all of these presidents, maybe up until 2016 Trump, is everybody kind of on the same team? What are your thoughts on this uniparty concept?
Well, I would go one step further. I wouldn't exclude Trump from that list. But yes, there is a uniparty for sure. And yes, you accurately identify, of course, Bush and the neocon cabal, the Project for a New American Century, which formed in the late 1990s. And of course, infamously wrote their Rebuilding America's Defenses document, warning about a new Pearl Harbor that would be necessary to justify the recreation of the American empire and extension of the American empire into the 21st century 1 year before 9/11. All of that history and craziness. Of course, and people rightly at the time identified the neocons as an existential threat to humanity, given the kind of bellicose warmongering that they were engaged in at the time and the craziness. For example, just one example of many, there was Seymour Hersh talking in, I believe, 2007 or 8, talking about, hey, Cheney tried to gin up this event with the Iranians using American sailors dressed up as Iranians on an Iranian ginned up PT boat, that they were going to cause this false naval incident in Iranian waters in order to justify an attack on Iran. And Seymour Hersh was ringing the alarm bell about that years and years ago. So yes, the neocons absolutely were part of this threat. But then of course, everyone went for hope and change. Obama, we want the peace guy who's going to come in and bring peace to the world. And he gets the Nobel Peace Prize for not being named George W. Bush, essentially. But of course, he just expanded all of the wars that Bush had started, including expanding the drone war into Pakistan and all sorts of craziness like that. The neoliberal agenda was essentially no different than the neoconservative agenda. It just wore a different cloak. And it came under the guise of responsibility to protect. R2P was this phrase that was being thrown around at the time by the neolib regime. And it was, for example, the justification for the overthrow of Gaddafi in Libya. You know, these spontaneous people's uprisings in Libya, and he's about to slaughter all these civilians. Trust us, guys. So we have to go in and deliver a humanitarian love bombing to free the Libyan people. And of course, once they had obliterated Libya, and of course, Gaddafi ended up sodomized in a gutter somewhere in the streets of Tripoli. What happened to Libya? Who cares? Whatever. Moving on to the next target. Oh, what actually happened to Libya is, for example, the creation of open-air slave markets, human slave markets operating in Libya just a few years after the attacks. But who cares about that? No one's talking about that, because of course it was never about the Libyan people. It was just a different cloak, a different guise for the same uniparty to do what they always do. So, of course, once that's all done, well, we need the next hope and change guy. And who comes down the golden escalator but Trump to deliver us all from this horrible regime. And he immediately in 2016 starts filling up the swamp with all the swamp dwellers that one would expect from Goldman Sachs and other deep state institutions, filling up his regime with them, putting John Bolton and Mike Pompeo and
let
other.
Me let me ask you this, because no, I get it, and I want to go there in a second. I guess the reason why I said, they're uniparty from really George H. Bush to Clinton to George W. to Obama, and then the reason I thought 2016 Trump was kind of the uniparty breaker was because he ran on that platform of, he has a famous interview with Jake Tapper where he said, we're no better off without Gaddafi and without Saddam Hussein. And Jake Tapper's like, wait a minute, you think we're better off if those guys were alive? And he was like, absolutely. And he almost ran on that anti-war, which is so funny considering what's happening now, but he ran on that anti-war, anti-drain the swamp concept to get in. But I think where you're about to take us, which I would like you to take us there, is as soon as he got in, it's almost like he became the swamp, right?
I think he never left the swamp. I think he was always part of it. But there is a good part to that story, which is that I think the American people and people around the world really genuinely want peace. They genuinely just want to go about their business and do their thing, and they just want the maximum freedom to do so. And when someone comes along and offers that, the promise of that to them, they jump at it. It's exactly why there was the Obama hope and change, hallelujah, we've got our savior back in 2008. And it's exactly why people were so excited about Trump in 2016.
Yeah.
But I think it's just, people are being taken advantage of over and over. Now, let me put it this way. I don't think Trump is in the same club, in the same globalist institutions as say a Biden or Obama or people like that. I think there is a difference, but ultimately I think Trump is in it for Trump, and I think he is a wheeler dealer, and we can get things done as long as it serves his particular interests. And given that, for example, first Sheldon Adelson and now Miriam Adelson have been some of his biggest donors, is it any surprising? Is it really that surprising that he is so gung-ho, unbelievably on board with Israel and anything Israel wants to do foreign policy-wise?
Yeah. And really, Israel's influence on, United States government, I mean, it goes back to all the way back to Kennedy. And obviously there's a lot of talk right now. I will tell you what happened in Gaza. I think it opened up Pandora's box in a way that I don't even think they were anticipating it to happen like that. And now everything is on the table. People are going back to say, wait a minute, what really happened with John F. Kennedy? We know it wasn't Lee Harvey Oswald. So let's talk about, the fights with David Ben-Gurion and, the founder of Israel, the nuclear proliferation of Israel that they wanted to do with the Dimona plant and all that. So the fact is they really screwed up by really genociding Gaza the way they did, because I feel like they opened up Pandora's box. Okay, I hear what you're saying on Trump, and I do think, it's almost like you've got your traditional globalist deep staters, the Bidens, Obamas, the Bush family, all of those guys. And then is Trump forming his own techno oligarch, deep staters, him, Elon, Peter Thiel, Palantir, all of that. Maybe we're going to have competing deep states.
That's a good way of putting it, because I think one of the things we are witnessing right now is the sort of the changeover or the upgrade, however you want to look at it, in the military industrial complex specifically. Look at the legacy contractors, the Boeings, the Raytheons, the Lockheed Martins, are being, if not replaced, at least displaced by Palantir and Anduril and L3. I can't remember the name of the company. There's a number of AI equipped, AI weaponry kind of institutions that are coming up and that are reaping huge rewards. In fact, since Trump 2 took office in January of this year, Palantir stock has almost doubled.
Yeah.
On the back of incredible rise in contracts in all levels of government. So we are seeing certainly an upgrade or a revision of the national security state for the 21st century. I don't think that's a good thing, but it is happening.
No, absolutely. The military industrial complex is something I've talked a lot about on this show, and I know you're a believer in that. Can you give us kind of your, I guess, when somebody asks you, "Hey James, what's the military industrial complex mean to you?" Give us that answer.
I wouldn't want to overthink it. I think it is precisely what it says on the label there. It is a conglomeration of military and industrial interests, which of course means not only corporate, but also there's the governmental side of it. And again, the best thing about that phrase, military industrial complex, is that it was not coined by some crazy, kooky internet conspiracy theorist. It was coined by Eisenhower on his way out the door in 1960, warning about the creation of a military industrial complex. So it's not that easy to dismiss when you have a literal president on his way out the door warning, ringing the alarm bell about the creation of this special interest that was at that time, over 50, 60, 70 years ago, was already starting to take over the US government. How much further along has that gone in the intervening 70 years? And here's just one tiny, tiny little example of that. Reading up on the B-2 strike that just happened at the 3 Iranian nuclear sites, you learn that, of course, it was the U.S. that had to strike the Fordo nuclear site in particular because it's carved into the side of a mountain deep underground. The only country on Earth with the bunker buster bombs that could reach Fordo is the United States. The only country on Earth that has the B-2 bombers that could transport bombs of that size was the United States. And as it turns out, the particular munitions, and I don't remember the exact ordnance, number that they designed it, but the particular bunker buster bombs that they used for that were specifically designed for Fordo. So, one can imagine if you specifically design a weapon for one specific particular target, at some point, sometime in the next 5, 10, 20, 30 years, at some point, that those munitions, you're going to find a reason to drop them on that particular target. And that's just one example of many.
And obviously a bunker busting bomb that's specifically designed for Fordo and for that place, that's not something that can get whipped up in weeks. So this really kind of leads to my next question.
Actually, before your next question, let me just tie in one other thread to this, because we've talked about the military industrial conglomeration of these corporate and governmental interests. Let's not forget the importance, for example, of the propaganda machine that makes all of this function, because it would not function without the support of the population generally. Top Gun Maverick. Remember that wonderful movie that came out a few years ago? Everyone loves it. It's amazing. What was that about? Of course, it was, without saying, it was about Iran. Right. It was about striking Iran. That's what that mission was supposed to be about, really. And it's just one way of embedding that in the public's imagination before it happens.
That is hilarious. You are absolutely right. That movie was all about that. I mean, I'm a big believer in, what do they call it? Oh my gosh, I'm blanking on the term. The way they...
Predictive programming?
Yeah, predictive programming. There you go. I mean, I'm a huge believer in that. And I look at so many, even on Netflix, I think last year or the year before, Leave the World Behind movie where, all of a sudden there were cyber outages and all that stuff. Like, I do believe in that. Do you think they do that to lessen the shock of something, or do they do that to get people ready for it? It's because it all seems to be a subconscious thing.
It certainly does. I think there is an aspect to it that once we have seen something and played it out in our imagination, it is at least easier to accept that it is happening in reality. If we watch all of these gung-ho, guns blazing, American military here to save the day movies over and over and over throughout our entire lives, then when the American military gets involved in some conflict overseas, we fill in the blanks with the whatever Rambo imagery or whatever we have in our minds that, hey, here's the good guys, they're fighting the bad guys. We've seen this many, many times, so we understand it in that way. I think it is a way of essentially manufacturing consent, to use a phrase.
Yeah. No, I do know that phrase, and I absolutely love that phrase. I think that's Noam Chomsky and I forget his co-writer, but
Herman, Edward Herman.
Yeah, Edward Herman. You're exactly right. But that it really is, and honestly, I mean, I said it at the beginning of the show, and I'll say it again. People like yourself, people like Whitney Webb, I consider you guys the base layer of really exposing so much of this stuff, whether it's all the things you've talked about in terms, your stuff on 9/11 is some of the best, and just helping people understand, what the Patriot Act, what it really did. And I almost feel like I really feel like we're about to potentially repeat a 20-year cycle. And it seems like geopolitics, and it seems like false flags, and quite frankly, tomfoolery or fuckery, if you want to call it that. It seems like they have these 20-year cycles, and all of a sudden people are ready for it again. I think, oh man, that's crazy. Okay, let me ask you this in terms of, so do you think that like all of this October 7th, Gaza, and then going into, Lebanon with taking out Hezbollah, changing Syria, like this is all part of a plan that had to have been concocted years ago. They're not making this shit up as they go. No way.
They certainly are not, and we can say that advisedly. So, for example, in my False Flags, A Secret History of Al-Qaeda documentary, it's a 5.5-hour documentary on the founding of Al-Qaeda and where it came from and what it's done and what's its various intelligence agency connections, etc. In that documentary, I talk, for example, about Clean Break, which was a document that was written by David Wormser and Richard Pearl and a couple of other of the PNAC neocon crowd before PNAC existed, I believe. And they were working on Project Clean Break or Operation Clean Break or whatever they called it at the time, which was a report specifically for the Israeli government, specifically for Netanyahu, actually, about how they would be able to, for example, topple Saddam in order to increase Israel's hold in the region. Obviously, regime change in Iraq and things like that had been planned out before, but we could go even further back to the 1980s. There's a document that I've cited a number of times called the Oded Yunon Plan for Greater Israel, which actually shows some of the map that we're starting to see the beginnings of right now with, for example, Syria and the Golan Heights. Israel has sort of moved into that area and is kind of taking it over. Not officially yet, ? But at any rate, they are militarily placed there now and starting to take it over. And we see, of course, what's happening with their battles in Lebanon, etc. We're starting to see the expansion of Israel into this greater Israel, which was talked about in this Oded Yunon planning document from 30 plus years ago, 35 years ago now. So yes, there are plans that have been on the table for decades. No one can say that it's a particular surprise that this is happening. The only question is, why now and what's the calculus behind that?
What do you think with Netanyahu in particular? I mean, this guy has been a thread that has been, through all this, and he's been around a long time. And gosh, I said this the other day on a podcast episode. I mean, I think he's one of the worst human beings on the planet, but he's good. He's really good. He's good at propaganda. He's good at all this. Do you think he's a decision maker in the process, or is he just a phenomenal spokesperson for everything?
I think a little bit of both. I think one cannot reach that stratified level of the political circus without having a little bit of the actual power as well as just some of the whatever it is, the je ne sais quoi that is required to sell agendas to the public. And of course, he did get his start essentially as a television personality, not literally. He was, I can't remember, in some low-level position in the Israeli diplomatic machinery in the United States in the late 1980s into 1990. At the time of the first Gulf War, which was when he first became a face that was known in the United States, specifically because he became the sort of go-to spokesman for the Israeli government in the CNN ongoing breathless 24/7 coverage of the first Gulf War, which of course was the first war that was that 24/7 news event. Netanyahu was a big part of that at the time. He was the go-to guy because a lot of the Israeli spokesmen have this funny English, hard to understand. But Netanyahu, having grown up and been educated in the US, spoke like an American, knew the American mindset, was able to essentially play into the CNN theatrics of the first Gulf War. And that's how he really became a big name in America, bigger than he was in Israel. And he parlayed that sort of American TV personality personage into a political career in Israel. So there is definitely an element of spokesman/showman about him and his career.
No, there absolutely is. And I thank God all of that now is coming back to haunt him, because all of those clips from 96 to 2002, 2005 to 2010, I mean, literally CNN, Megyn Kelly, Candace Owens, I did it. So many people have strung together. He's the boy who cried wolf when it comes to Iran having a nuclear weapon. He's been parroting the same talking points for 30 years. And like you said, luckily with the access to new media, that message is getting out. I mean, if there was not social networks, I mean, this would be probably done by now. So that makes a lot of sense. Okay, what do you think's going to happen? I mean, what do you think the next steps are with this, in particular with Iran? Would Russia and China ever, and maybe Pakistan, would they ever actually, if push comes to shove, come to Iran's aid by offering nuclear weapons as the ultimate deterrent?
Well, as people might have seen in recent days, Medvedev, who is still hanging around in the Russian government, I don't even know what his position is at this point. But at any rate, Medvedev came out the other day and said that that countries around the world would be happy to supply Iran with nuclear warheads, I believe was the phrase that he used, which of course caused Trump to have a bit of a meltdown about the N word, nuclear.
Yeah.
Right. And rightfully so. That is definitely provocative talk at this time. Having said that, what's the actual Russian response been so far? Surprisingly muted, considering they just recently signed a defense agreement with Iran just several months ago. It turns out, no, mutual defense wasn't actually part of that agreement, as Putin was quick to clarify, meaning we're happy to take Iran's drones and any sort of technology you can supply us for the Ukraine front, but we're not coming in to help you guys, which is actually quite surprising because, as I say, my second ever podcast episode, World War III Starts in Iran, specifically was revolving around the comments that Putin was making at the Munich Security Conference in 2007, warning the Bush administration at that time about going into Iran and that kind of red line. And if you do that, game on, essentially was the message that was being floated at that time. Well, we've just seen an actual U.S. strike on Iran. And so far, Putin has been clear that there will not be a military aid response at this point. Perhaps that would change if there's a regime change operation, like an active military operation to assassinate Khamenei or what have you. But at this point, we haven't seen that. And China so far has been extremely guarded in its statements, just saying the sort of diplomatic mealy mouth speak that you would expect of, war is bad. We shouldn't have war. Like, okay, great. But what are you going to do about it? Apparently, at this point, nothing. It's interesting at any rate, because I've been listening for years and years and years and years to this crowd of people, a lot of whom I think are probably on a payroll of a government or two, screaming about BRICS are the saviors and they're going to save us from these crazy neocons and Israel and all of this crazy NATO foreign warmongering. And so far, the BRICS have been utterly silent about what's going on in Iran, and Russia and China have not stepped up to the plate. So it does beg the question of what would actually be necessary in order to really generate some sort of actual military resistance against this. Certainly not what we've seen so far, I guess.
Yeah.
But I think the real calculus is the point at which, for example, China decides, you know what, US is involved enough in Israel or in Iran and all that brouhaha. Why don't we take Taiwan? And Russia says, okay, we're going to go, and no special military operation. We're just going to go and take Kiev. And India is looking at it and says, okay, now it's on with Pakistan. That is the point at which it becomes World War III, not because of any one of those particular actions, but because the general calculus is now's the time, the window of opportunity where we can get what we want. And it just becomes this snowballing event. That's, I think, the real danger of events like these, is that they can start that snowball rolling down the hill.
That's a very interesting trilogy right there. Let me pose this to you. Do you think Trump, Putin, and Xi Jinping could get together and say, okay, Xi, you get Taiwan. We're not going to mess with that. Putin, you know what? Take Ukraine. That's that. And then we're going to implement regime change in Iran, and then Iran becomes ours. I mean, gosh, could they divvy it up like that?
One could imagine such scenarios. Let's put it this way. I could very much imagine Trump sacrificing Ukraine, like, hey, you go take Ukraine.
Yeah.
But the Taiwan thing is much, much more difficult. I think I don't imagine that Trump would have any interest in allowing Taiwan to be taken because, of course, it is the semiconductor industry essentially is there. And if China takes that over, it is game over for the international electronics, and everything that runs on electronics would be beholden to the Chinese communists. So I think that the price of that would be much, much higher. Having said that, there are people floating the idea that Trump is trying to do a reverse Kissinger. And in order to set that up, you have to understand that Kissinger, really on behalf of Rockefeller, but anyway, Kissinger, of course, did the famous, well, the not famous, the secretive trip to Beijing in 1970 before Nixon went, of course, famously to meet Mao Zedong. It was Kissinger who went the year before in a secret meeting that was not revealed until decades later to sort of pave the way for that. And the calculus at the time was, we can rip Beijing away from Moscow in the Cold War. We can bring them into our team. And so that there's the Sino-Soviet split. We're going to widen that split so they're not collaborating with each other. It's the great game of geopolitics. Well, now the idea is, well, is Trump trying to do a reverse Kissinger, basically take Moscow away from Beijing? Because, of course, Moscow and Beijing have been getting closer and closer in recent years, realizing that they're being surrounded by NATO. It makes sense that they would collaborate more. But if Trump can sort of get Russia more on board with the U.S. and placate him in Ukraine or whatever needs to happen, then they can concentrate on the real problem, many in the Trump regime would put it, which is China.
Okay.
Maybe I'm biased because I'm here in the Asia Pacific, sort of with a front row seat to it, but I think the U.S.-China is at the very least, the Cold War 2.0 for the 21st century, if not the real World War III of the 21st.
Okay, no, I totally get that. So the U.S.-China competition, let's call it that. So that's real, huh? Like, the thing I've tried to figure out is, how strong is the U.S.? Like, how strong is our military really? Like, if push comes to shove, how much bigger and badder are we than everybody else? Because really, that's what it comes down to. Because in my mind, I always thought we must be so strong that China and Russia and Iran and North Korea collectively, like we're such a bully that those four countries, I would imagine, have had to get together and say, okay, can the four of us kick this guy's ass? And that answer must be no. Still, I don't know. What do you think? I mean, how strong are we?
So in the post-World War II era of U.S. military dominance, the superpower of the world, this explicit strategy was to make the U.S. military into a two-war military. The idea that it could fight simultaneously two major theater wars on different parts of the globe and still be able to maintain that. And that was, of course, a huge investment, a huge expense. That's why the U.S. military budget has always been orders of magnitude bigger than any of its rivals. In fact, all of its rivals put together still are dwarfed by the U.S. military budget because they have been aiming at that. In recent decades, I would say that calculus is changing. Now it's, 1.5, maybe one war military. I'm not sure they would be able to do that, which is why we see this desperation to try to get NATO, NATO members. No, you have to commit 5% of your GDP to this, or getting Europe to build up its own defense, essentially as the US's way of maintaining that two-war idea. But one war could be fought by Europe and then we could fight the other war, or something along those lines. So I think there is a change that is happening. And you know what? If the Russians and the Chinese and other strategic rivals are playing the long game of waiting for the U.S. to sort of wear itself out before they attack, well, then they've been doing a good job for the past couple of decades, because certainly the U.S. has been its own worst enemy in Afghanistan and Iraq, and extending itself in the Middle East and trying to move into the Asia Pacific, et cetera, et cetera. It's, it's very much a question. And I think there is a calculus that will be made at some point where China and Russia and Iran and whoever else wants to make a play will realize, hey, if we all go at the same time, what's the U.S. going to do about it?
Yeah, that's really where the rubber meets the road. If they ever said, hey, if we all go at the same time, they're not going to be able to stop us. Like, do you think Putin and Xi Jinping, like, are they friends? Are they frenemies? Like, I mean, do you have friends at that level? I don't even know.
Yeah, yeah, good question. I wouldn't trust if I was in a
Yeah,
position of power. I don't think I would trust anyone else in a position of power like that.
yeah,
I don't think friendship exists at that level. Of course, they make a big deal of it that Putin and Xi have this personal friendship, and they like to get together and meet and talk about their friendship,
yeah,
etc. But what does that really mean? I think it is interesting because for me, just examining it in a cold geopolitical way, it seems like China and Russia would be natural friends, that they are
yes,
geographically together. They're also both
yes,
obviously surrounded by NATO and NATO interests. So why wouldn't they go together? But there's always been that tension between China and Russia historically. We saw that manifested in the Sino-Soviet split in the Cold War. In recent years, there has been definitely basically, they've been pushed together by various events. And so they are cooperating much more than they ever have before. But
yeah.
yeah, to what extent is that a deep, real underlying friendship, and to what extent is it an alliance of convenience? I guess will be tested probably if a reverse Kissinger or whatever actually does take place. And I think I mean, let's put it this way: Russia and China definitely have economic interests together, but they also have their own competing economic and military and geopolitical strategic interests. And interestingly, we've seen the flip happen in the 21st century, where obviously China was always sort of the junior partner economically and militarily. I think it's different now. I think, honestly, Russia is more beholden to China at this point, economically, at any rate.
I think so too. I think the difference is the Russian army's been tested and the Chinese army, even though it's, I'm sure, amazing, it just hasn't been battle tested. They haven't been in anything. Two questions. So Taiwan, fundamentally Taiwan, it's really the semiconductor thing, because I know the United States doesn't give a shit about like the freedom of the Taiwanese people or anything like
Yeah,
that.
of
It's
course.
it's yeah, it's the protection of the semiconductor. Okay, so that's what that is all about. And then let me ask you, since you are in Southeast Asia, obviously most Americans, when they hear Russia, China, they think communism, and then they think the lives of the people there are so awful. Ironically, when TikTok, this was hilarious, and since you're not on TikTok, you might not know this, but over the holidays, right leading up until New Year's, when they took TikTok down for 24 hours, a new TikTok replacement, or it's not even a replacement, Red Note, which I believe is the TikTok of China, all of a sudden, all these Americans joined Red Note. And it was in Chinese, but then you had Americans conversing with Chinese, and the Chinese were showing them, hey, this is our grocery store. Look how fresh our fish is. Look at our vegetables. Look at our fruits. And by the way, look at my grocery bill. This comes out to $6.90 something cents, where the same thing at Costco would have been like $160 or something along those lines. Those countries, I mean, life is not bad in China, right? Life is not bad in Russia. Or is it? I don't know.
Depends who you ask, I would imagine, like anywhere else
Okay.
on Earth. So,
Yeah.
yeah, it is interesting, the supermarket diplomacy that goes on. Of course, everyone remembers Tucker's trip to Moscow, and wow,
Yes.
look at the supermarket, right? Everyone everyone hones in on
Yeah.
that. But it's so incredibly difficult to do lifestyle comparisons between countries, because it's not only just a crass economic thing that comes down to $6 for this amount of groceries. It's the entire culture of everything that is happening in that country. And of course, one thing that you could say about China over the course of the past 25 years, yeah, for the average person, they've gone from agricultural peasants basically scraping by with a meager subsistence living to living in these big cities and having all these electronics, and they got the latest iPhones and things like this. So a great improvement, right? Well, I suppose in a crass economic material sense, yes, but also the working conditions in China that has led to this are absolutely horrific. And the Foxconn installing the suicide nets and all of that give you some example of the sort of the difference, the cultural
Wow.
difference between being a worker in the United States and being a worker in China, and the types of things that go on there. So there's so many different calculations to go on when you're trying to compare lifestyles between countries. But maybe that's kind of the point. I think people are people, and they're all trying to do what they can given the circumstances they're in. And to the extent that cross-cultural conversations like that can happen, instead of China just being some vague, weird
Right.
enemy
Right.
that's out
Right.
there. No, these are real human beings that we can talk to, and we can find out, hey, we're kind of the same. That, to some whatever extent that can happen, it's good, because it obviously tamps down the war rhetoric that
Yes,
governments
yes.
still need. And that's an important point, one that I come back to over and over. The amount of propagandizing that goes on is, of course, horrific. And the fact that it does work on so many people is horrific. But at the very least, it shows that they still need our consent. They still need us to think certain things and to go along with certain agendas in order for them to do what they do. And to the extent that we can undermine that, and the extent that some English teacher in Japan can start a podcast and start talking to literally millions of people around the world, it's crazy. The world we're living in right now. And I think few people really stop to think about it, because that is my life. I think about it a lot.
Yeah. Well, listen, I am going to put all your information in our description. I know you have a little bit of a hard stop today. I have to beg you, though, we need to do another episode, because the reverse Henry Kissinger, I wanted to talk about the forward Henry Kissinger. Now there's a reverse Henry Kissinger move. No, I really feel like that guy is one of the people. He was like a puppet master that pulled the strings of so much. And the more people can understand that, quite frankly, our presidents are not really the ones calling the shots at the end of the day, whether it's Dick Cheney, like you said, President Cheney, which I loved how you slipped that one in there, or Henry Kissinger, or, what's that? Victoria Nuland, all these names, Paul Wolfowitz, all those guys that were such a part of that. And then even today, all the people that are involved behind the scenes in the Trump organization, I think people need to understand.
What was Kissinger's last book? It was co-written with Eric Schmidt and someone else about artificial intelligence.
About artificial intelligence, and Eric Schmidt being the former CEO of Google. That guy's locked into a lot of things. All right, listen, any parting words for us?
I will just say, if people are interested in what we've been talking about, I have lots of stuff on my site with regards to this, including, of course, that Trump bombs Iran update that I just did. I talked about the Israel strikes when they happened on Iran a couple of weeks ago. I've done an entire episode on Meet Benjamin Netanyahu, unconvicted war criminal. So I have a lot in the archives on these subjects if people are interested.
That's amazing. I haven't seen that one, so I'll put that on my list. I will put all your information. James, it's been a pleasure. James Corbett, the Corbett Report. I'm not kidding. This is somebody that I honestly, I'm going to take it as one of my missions to get more of your information out there. You're not on Instagram, you're not on TikTok, but I'll tell you what, there's going to be about 50 clips of this interview, and hopefully some will catch fire. So anyway, listen, I really appreciate your time and all the things you do. Hang on the line for a second. All right, everybody. This has been an honor. This is honestly, this is the first time I've, what's that word? Geeked out. No, not even geeked out. I fanboyed out a little bit because I've respected your work for many years. So anyway, I appreciate it. Call a spade a spade. Hang on the line, James, and we'll talk to you guys soon.
This episode was brought to you by the new book, Deep Shallow Dive Into You, available now on Amazon and Barnes & Noble in hardcover and paperback. Don't forget to sign up for our new mailing list on our website at deepshallowdive.com.